Ladies and gentlemen, it is episode 1 of the sparkly new Nerdcast! Yes! Woo! I am your host, Pete Dagan, CEO of Wordnerds and all-round good egg. And I'm joined today, as ever, by my partner in linguistic crime, Steve Erdl, our Chief Scientific Officer.
Lovely to be here. But can you refer to yourself as a good egg? Is that not what people normally say about people rather than what you say about yourself?
Well, I mean, I can because...
Is it just because of you look similar to an egg?
I started early on the bald gags. Yeah, honestly, I'm just trying to make the tech work and speak at the same time. So if complete nonsense comes out of my mouth, you will know why. Anyway, since you've started this, Chief Scientific Officer, Steve, what the hell is one of them?
That's a great question. I was a floppy-haired arts graduate that somehow ended up with Spock's job title. But I'm a recovering linguist, and my job is to help with the underlying stuff, the underlying language that makes Wordnerds what it is.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. All right, everybody knows everybody. You're extremely welcome. The Nerdcast, for those who didn't know, is a podcast about customer experience, insights, all things to do with the way that customers and brands communicate and do or don't listen to each other. We've recorded a couple of these now across a couple of different verticals: housing, transport, some of the areas where Wordnerds is really active. And we hope you find it useful. Some of it's related to the stuff that we do professionally. Some of it really isn't. And we're really excited today because we have an interview to share with you with Polly and Victoria from the Housing Ombudsman's office.
What an interesting interview, though. Like,
yeah.
It's so interesting to see. So, if you don't know, the Housing Ombudsman is, as most ombudsmen are, there to oversee, regulate, and where necessary, arbitrate on issues that people are having with their housing association. But they've taken that to a whole new place. They're doing really new, interesting things with it, and it's such an interesting area for customer experience at the moment, housing. So it seemed like a really good place to start our podcast adventure.
It really does, and it really is, and we really will. But before we do, we have decided that before we get into the bones of whatever it is we're going to discuss every episode, and every episode there will be a different theme. Today it's the Housing Ombudsman and where they are. We want to just share one thing that each of us has learned in the last few days, weeks, months, or in my case, decades, because I learned so precious little. So, Steve, what have you learned this week?
So I should apologise this front. As I said at the start, my area of interest, both personally and professionally, is language. It's the way in which people use language, and we use that understanding to reach the parts that AI can't with text analysis. So I thought I'd start with maybe in the first one, I thought it would be only fair to start with a language fact. So I'd like to take you now to wintry British Columbia in Canada and the indigenous people there who speak a language called the carrier language. And they do something really, really interesting with nouns. I know all the best stories start with they do something really, really interesting with nouns. But what they do is they have different nouns for the thing, the type of thing that you are that you're talking about. So bringing someone a glass of water, the word bring would be a completely different word if you were bringing them a T-shirt and they've got 6 things. If you can guess one, I'll give you 100,000 pesos. They've got 6 things, and whichever of the things they think a new thing is most like, it'll take on that noun. It'll take on that verb as they're talking about it. So they've literally got a list of 6 things, which are, the first one's sugar.
Wow.
Then beans.
Okay.
Stick. Shirt. Tea. And fluff. And a new thing, whichever one they think it's closest to, it'll take on that properties of that noun and you'll use that verb to describe it. So golf ball, for example, is closest to bean. So of those 6 things. So it takes on the same thing as bean.
Wow. Not the way I hit it. It's closer to sugar when I hit it, baby.
Mate, it's absolutely. Turns into fluff almost immediately. But your golf club would be closest, I would imagine, to stick. So you would take on the thing. So they've got these 6 things, and they break up the whole of language based on which one of those 6 things it's most similar to.
Okay. So I'm a bit annoyed by this now.
Tell me why.
Because my interesting thing is much less interesting than your interesting thing. And I must have misread the memo, because I've gone for something kind of industry related and serious. And
wow. So something that might actually help our listeners rather than just some random nonsense about
the
Canadian
random
fluff.
thoughts of a corpus linguist who's been locked out of his data cave for too long.
That's the title of my autobiography. Tell me your interesting fact about that might actually help people.
It's more of an ensemble piece than a fact, which is to say that there aren't really any facts in it. But last week, a few of us were at Housing 23 in Manchester, which was and is always one of our favourite events that we go to. I think, so firstly, it's a great opportunity to talk to a few people, bump into a bunch of customers, see people that we know directly, tangentially, whatever. The scale of it just seems to get bigger and bigger every year. And it's always great fun. Obviously, you never get invited to these things.
I never get invited to these things.
Yeah. More on that next episode. But I thought it was really interesting. A lot of the chat was about the new kind of social housing regulation that's coming in. And this is regulation on top of regulation on top of regulation, right? Yeah. It feels like we've just had tenant satisfaction measures. We've just had the Ombudsman's powers changing so that they can levy unlimited fines. Yeah. And the industry feels like an industry not under attack, but an industry that is having change thrust upon it.
Absolutely, based on some high profile and in some cases tragic events that have it made this kind of a necessary thing, but then it's so challenging for the people in that field, right? The fact that people then have to implement this stuff, they have to understand it. The whole landscape's completely changed and is continuing to change, and they have to deal with it. And so much of it revolves around what the customers are saying and feeling. It's a really challenging time. Yeah,
it really is. And just the range of, it's just a bizarre event, because on the one hand, you've got somebody dressed as a door, selling...
Someone dressed as a door?
Genuinely dressed as a door. And I was kind of sitting there going, this is a really weird conference, because on the one hand, you've got people who want to come and look at doors. And on the other, you've got all of these people who are, up to high dough about what the hell they're going to do with this new regulation coming in. It was fascinating and brilliant. Right. Anyway, we're digressing. We've shared something that we've learned in the last week. Steve's was much more interesting than mine. I will try to up my game before next episode, I promise. But for the time being, let's hand over to the guys at the Ombudsman's office and hear from Polly and Victoria. We're very, very pleased to welcome Polly Cox and Victoria King to the Nerdcast this morning. Polly is Sector Learning and Development Manager. Victoria is Sector Learning and Development Lead. I'm saying that very carefully and reading it off a board, because I've already got that wrong twice so far. And we're very grateful for them giving us their time this morning to join us. Guys, do you want to start by giving us a little bit of background about where you come to this from, what you do, and what's going on at the moment?
Okay, well, I'll make a start. So I'm Polly. I've been working with the Ombudsman Service since March at the beginning of this year. And I have been recruited to develop the Centre for Learning, which is learning for landlords, so they can take away the information that our systemic teams and who provide the reports and turn it into interesting, digestible and easy to take on board knowledge, so landlords can then go away and change their services for the better for our landlords. I have a long history of working in social housing, and so I have a resident engagement and complaints background. And then I'll hand you over to Victoria, who can tell you a little bit about her background.
Yeah, so Polly and I are working together as part of the Quality Engagement and Development Directorate Sector Learning Development Team. One of the Housing Ombudsman's 4 values is learning, and what we are doing is we're working with the rest of the Housing Ombudsman staff to share knowledge and insights to maximise our impact and improve services, particularly with housing complaints. And one of our strategic programs is about encouraging learning through our Centre for Learning, which I'll talk a little bit about later on, something we're going to be promoting big time this year. So I'm trying to get in as much about that as possible. So my background is I was a teacher, and then I've worked in the civil service in various learning and development roles. I also worked in a complaints team and an advocacy organisation. So when I joined the Housing Ombudsman early this year, it just aligned everything I already knew, and loving it already. So thank you very much for having us on today.
Not at all. It's you doing us a favour and not the other way around. It's really interesting. So you're both in kind of learning and development roles for the Ombudsman. So it's about translating what's going on from a regulatory legal perspective and trying to turn it into messages that normal humans can understand. Is that a fair summary?
That's exactly what we're aiming to do.
Could I ask guys, when you say learning, there's obviously a great deal of people within the supply chain of housing that require that level of education. Do you see your role as broad across all sort of different aspects of housing associations and also the tenants, the customers as well?
Yeah, so we're providing content that is useful or should be useful for landlords of local authorities, for housing associations, TMOs, almshouses, and all aspects of social housing, but also including our governance teams. So we're about to do a big piece on support for the member responsible for complaints, and we will have a conference coming up later this year, which I'll shamelessly plug now. And so it is for everybody, but it's about taking that, like Victoria was saying earlier, it's taking that information that we find that the people in the background at Housing Ombudsman Service are pulling together, and then turning that so it's useful for all those different organisations to take away to support their services.
Fantastic. 2 questions in, 2 plugs so far. We're 1 question per plug ratio at the moment. If you can keep this up all the way through, I will be very impressed. So what's keeping you guys busy at the moment? I mean, obviously, it's been a period of tremendous change in the past few years, past few months generally in housing. What's occupying your time at the minute?
I'm not sure if you've seen on the Housing Ombudsman website, but have a look if not. And it sort of links to the data standards, which I think you want to talk about a bit later on. We've just produced a spotlight report on knowledge and information management. So spotlight reports are a series of reports that we produce. They were two every year, but they're moving to 1 a year now. So we've done ones on damp and mold, noise, cold comfort. So our latest one is on that knowledge and information management. So what historically we used to do is just produce this really good report, but it's got a lot of words in it, and put that out there, and perhaps do a webinar, and then just leave it with landlords really to implement the recommendations that we've come up with as a result of the investigation into that topic. What we're looking at doing now is building a lot more resources around that, so we can take the really good content that is in that report and put it in a way that can be learned. As there's been loads of studies on how much people retain, and by reading a report, the average retention is like 5%. So we're trying to get it up. So I've been really busy working on an e-learning, putting together some virtual classrooms, doing some speaking events all around this knowledge and information management report. and also recorded our own podcast. We're going to be doing that for each of our spotlight reports. The next one will be in the autumn around communications. So we don't just release the spotlight report and that's it. We then do further investigations into that topic and see how the recommendations have been implemented within landlord organisations. And we take the good practice that has happened within those organisations and share it. So it gives an update to everybody on how the recommendations have been implemented. So we're going to be producing lots of those types of reports, learning around those reports. We're trying to create lots of resources around sort of what we do to help people understand what we do, and some of the other things that we produce, like insight reports and paragraph 49 or special investigations. So we're trying to demystify what we're doing, taking the information that we're getting from complaints and then pushing it out there and making it learner centric and trying to improve the sector.
Would you mind just unpacking a little bit? I think I know, but unpacking a little bit exactly what you mean by knowledge information management.
Knowledge and information management encompasses how data is created, stored, used, and shared. And it's actually often referred to as record keeping. And we recognise that record keeping is a really useful shorthand, but it refers to storing data only and doesn't reflect the other three aspects of knowledge and information management: creating data, storing data, using data, and sharing data.
That's fascinating because we've done a little bit of work previously looking at the language used in ombudsman serious maladministration cases, and whilst oftentimes the cause of sort of the catalyst of that kind of issue is flooding or infestation or damp and mold. Actually, what pushes it over the top seems to be there's lots of discussion in there about record keeping, about staff training, about the actual kind of use of the data that can often turn, it seems to us, a difficult situation into a really, really bad one.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the reason why we focused on knowledge and information management in this particular spotlight report, because it was a running theme through all of our previous investigations.
And Victoria, you mentioned that part of your purpose is to pull out good stuff as well as the bad stuff, and some examples of best practice with the record keeping or the knowledge information management stuff. What are you seeing that is best practice?
I would always say good practice, because is there really ever a best practice? So in the report, there are loads and loads of examples, case studies of good practice, and some of not so good practice, and what the learning can be taken from them. And the resources that we are creating as part of the Centre for Learning, I think that's plug number 3 now. We're taking case studies, good examples, and weaving that into our learning. So landlords can read the report and then perhaps come to one of our webinars and really contextualize it with some case studies and identifying what is good, and then we're going to be building on that by sort of encouraging networking between landlords to share that best practice going forward. And that's one of our big hopes as part of the Centre for Learning that we're going to be working on this year.
And can you just give us an example of a good practice? Just because I think sometimes these things come to life when you start talking about the exact specifics.
Okay. So this is an example of strong records enabling a landlord to respond effectively on service charges. So this is something that we saw is from a gentleman called Mr. M. He complained about his landlord's handling of his service charge account, and he said that his landlord had charged him for the same major works twice in error. So in response to the complaint, the landlord was able to provide financial records dating back more than 6 years, evidencing that Mr. M had not paid twice, and accompanying it with an explanation of the relevant charges. This information even included a period before the landlord took over responsibility for Mr. M's lease. So we're saying this is an example not only of good financial information, but knowledge of the history of the properties taken on in a post-merger case. So having those strong records, those contemporaneous records, so who added that log, when was it logged, what has the situation been, so you can easily go back through and say, this is what has happened, and deal with the case quickly.
I mean, it's great to get a comment like that from James Bond's boss. I mean, that's.
I was going to make the same
there we
joke.
go,
No wonder
so-
James Bond is in such a state these days if Emma's casting aspersions like that.
But it's a really great example of that kind, because I think often it feels like the ombudsman is seen as the arbiter for bad practice, but actually it sounds like what you're trying to do is also curate good practice, which is that's a really exciting thing, and obviously really valuable for landlords of all kinds, because that gives them that kind of that ability to see what they can learn from, as well as where difficulties are.
Yeah, exactly. And then try and copy it and see and analyze and evaluate how effective that's been within their own organisation, so they can continuously improve.
Yeah,
Great.
we're looking at our centre for learning. We don't want it to be stick. We want it to be carrot, or carrot cake, as we like to say in our team.
So just before we get on to, we want to talk about in a loop, out a loop, some of the kind of ways of handling complaints at different levels. Before we do, obviously, last few months have, TSMs have come in and changed the whole kind of way that that particularly housing associations are listening to their residents. The powers of the ombudsman have also changed recently. How have you noticed the landscape moving in the last few months?
In terms of the awareness of the ombudsman, it means we are getting an awful lot more residents contacting us and landlords contacting us. Interestingly, I was in a meeting just before this. We were saying a week in November we took a certain amount of calls. Last week we took the same amount of calls that week in November in one day.
Wow.
But that's partly why the ombudsman is taking on more staff. So obviously, the more that residents are aware of the services that we provide, the more that they will contact us. Therefore, we need more staff to be able to deal with those issues.
I know. And do you think that's the only cause of that? Because that isn't it. It's a phenomenal increase in the work that you're having to do. Is it broadly because of better understanding of that complaints process, or do you think there are other reasons too?
I think a lot of it is to do with the understanding, and obviously the ombudsman's been pushing that landlords publicise our service to their residents, which obviously they have been doing by the amount of calls that are coming through, and that can only be a good thing. We've spent a lot of time trying to sort of change that view that complaints is a bad thing, and actually taking them and then using those to actually improve the services for landlords. And I feel that some of the landlords that we've been working with are really beginning to see that benefit.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? You're because of your success in getting those people to contact you, you're probably experiencing some of the same challenges that housing associations are having with the volume of people contacting you. So how are you coping with the logistical issues that throws up?
Well, like I said, we have increased the staffing ratio is massively increased, and we are taking on new staff all the time. But obviously, that takes time for them to be able to be inducted and go through that process and actually be able to provide the service that we want them to. And then I guess one of the other things that we do is that we do prioritise. So if we've got a vulnerable resident on the end of the phone in the middle of winter that's saying they've had no heat and hot water for a long period of time, then we will move that case to the top of the list to manage and deal with.
Well, what a brilliant segue into into what we're going to talk about. And obviously you've had several thousand plugs in now, so if you need some software to help you work out what people are telling you, I think I know a platform that might be excellent for you. So do give us a shout.
He knows everyone, this guy. It's great. Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about complaints already, and I have a simple question that is probably a really, really, really difficult one to answer because there are so many different potential answers. But in your mind, what is a complaint?
So our complaint handling code describes a complaint as an expression of dissatisfaction, however made, about the standard of service, actions, or lack of action by the organisation, its own staff, or those acting on its behalf, affecting an individual resident or group of residents. So we say in there, however made, so that's designed to be inclusive of all the forms of communication which exist between landlords and residents. So it's not back in the day, it had to be a written expression of dissatisfaction. It's not that anymore. It's any expression of dissatisfaction. The resident doesn't have to use the word complaint in order for it to be treated as a complaint. It's also important that landlords recognise the difference between what is a complaint and what is a service request, because sometimes the line can be a little blurred. So we would say that a service request is a request from a resident, their landlord requiring action to be taken to put something right. And we talked about knowledge and information management, and any service request should be recorded, monitored, and reviewed regularly. With a complaint, it should be raised when a resident raises dissatisfaction with a response to that service request. We also had a really good question at one of our complaint handling code sessions, which we ran earlier this month. A landlord asked us, they said, the definition of a complaint is any expression of dissatisfaction. So if the customer doesn't want it to be a complaint, but it appears to be a complaint under the definition, do we just explain why it's not a complaint in the records that they're writing? And we would always say that it's completely resident led. So it might be that the resident doesn't want to put the issue down in the complaints process, but at the same time, it might actually be in your best interest to put it through the complaints process. There are some residents that raise lots of issues on a very regular basis, but always say they don't want to complain. It's about recording the reasons, and I've already mentioned that those contemporaneous notes. So on a simple level, yes, if it's an expression of dissatisfaction comes in and you decide that you can resolve it quickly within days to the resident satisfaction, you can give yourself that window to try and resolve it before it sort of tips over into a complaint. So the short answer, any expression of dissatisfaction, however made, but there are many nuances to that.
Absolutely. I mean, and all these things are on a continuum, right? From something that's very clearly a service request to something that's very clearly a complaint, and then there's 50 shades of grey in between those two things. Do you have a sense of which side of the line you would recommend housing associations are on? Like, if in doubt, should they be looking to put more things through the complaint process, or should they be looking to minimise the number of complaints that are coming through?
Completely resident led, and dependent on the circumstances. And that's, again, the importance of having those records, because if it has been that something that particular resident has raised lots of issues on a regular basis, but say they don't want to complain, it might actually be better to put it through the complaints process so it can get rectified. It's completely dependent on the circumstances, what has happened to the resident, but it is resident led
and requires the open and honest communication with the resident as well. So you need that good relationship with your residents in order to do that, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah, and knowing your residents as well, and working with them and having that good communication with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of that, I mean, I think that we're talking a lot about complaints being a positive. We have a webinar. That's our second plug. So we're closing the gap. We have a webinar at the moment that we called "Congratulations, They Complained," because it's gone from being seen as a really negative thing to actually they're complaining to you, and they are doing so before they're escalating it, and so on and so forth. But it has provided this significant challenge to housing associations. I just wondered if you had any good practice of how to kind of quickly acknowledge and prioritize individual complaints.
So having a sufficient sort of central system in place to capture complaints as they come in, which each department's got access to, will actually help you organise that. But when a complaint is received, you're needing to be checking to see what you've got recorded on the system, how they'd prefer to be contacted, and you need to acknowledge in that form. If you're going to send like an automatic acknowledgement email, because that's convenient for you as the landlord, but again, if you don't follow that up with contact from an actual person, then it's perceived as being cold and impersonal, and that becomes a barrier to actual real communication. And prioritizing is simple in handling some complaints, i.e. do you need to go around there straight away to make sure that an elderly or a vulnerable person has got a warm home in the winter? Or is it a matter that requires time to review that documentary evidence you've got there? So like looking through your account system, and will someone need like a head start on assessing whether it's to enable you to actually respond within that timescale? But we know it's not always that simple. But without considering what you know about the individual and their circumstances and the circumstances of the complaint, you might well miss something.
Absolutely. So that's kind of the context of the complaint itself, but then the wider context of that that individual person, and the basis of that is getting to know your tenants so that you understand what their context is when they do come to you with a complaint.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, if you can have a member of staff that can contact that person within the same day and actually have that conversation, actually really understand what that complaint is. And if you've misunderstood what the original complaint is and you've gone all guns blazing to resolve that, the customer at the end of the line still isn't going to be happy.
Just jumping in there. So one of the things that we hear about, we were talking to a complaints handler at a housing association a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying that exactly that. She loves to, as soon as a complaint comes in, she loves to get on the phone and actually, get to the bottom of what's going on, because you can tell so much more. Their records aren't perfect. You can tell so much more about whether somebody is vulnerable or whether there are other things going on from a phone conversation. She was talking about the time pressures. Obviously, there's the 5-day acknowledgement window and then the 10 days to resolve the issue. And she was saying that with the number of open complaints that they have, it's a real challenge. It allows only a very small amount of time. I think she said, depending on how busy they are, it works out as between 2 and 6 hours per complaint. And obviously, some are very easy and straightforward, and they're easy to resolve. Some are much more complex and require them to go back and build up timelines. Talk to us about kind of time pressures and what housing associations should do if they find that they are struggling with some of the time pressures involved.
Yeah, we ran not long ago, maybe a week ago, complaint handling code drop-in session, and we had a very, very similar question around that. Yeah. So in our complaint handling code, it does give the ability to offer extensions. So for example, if there's a complex complaint at 9 working days old, the landlord is not going to be able to resolve it within 10 working days, but they will be looking to get a response out to the resident within the following 10 working days. What we're looking for is evidence of a plan. It also says here about if the response isn't going to go out within 10 working days, the landlord should be communicating with the resident and proposing a plan for a response.
It's that communication again. It's keeping those channels of communication between the landlord and the resident so they understand, because more often than not, residents are actually, it's the silence. If they don't hear anything, then they assume nothing's happening. If you communicate what you're doing, then people are far more accepting.
I love the idea of a jointly agreeable plan as well, because some things are complex, and I think particularly when there's contractors or third parties involved, and it might take a while for the facts to get assessed. I think that kind of pragmatic approach is hugely important.
Taking a step back from that, we've talked quite a lot about what we would refer to as the inner loop. So how you go about solving that one complaint to the satisfaction of the resident. We also sometimes talk about the outer loop, being that when you go about collating those complaints together to get a better understanding of what your housing association or what your organisation can do to make things better for all of your residents based on the complaints that you have had. A lot of the people that we talk to are people in insights roles or customer experience roles, and the ability to kind of collate the information so that they can educate and embed key learning within their organization is quite an important priority for them. So I just wondered if you could speak to any good practice you've seen around using the outcomes of your complaint investigations overall to get a better sense of how you can improve your organization in the future.
Obviously, Section 7 of our code is encouraging landlords to use complaints as a source of intelligence to identify issues and to introduce those positive changes in service delivery. Some landlords publish resident communication in newsletters, and they'll put them up on their websites. And they should, if possible, include that learning from complaints. So again, it's that showing the residents that, almost that sort of, you said, we did. So you complained about this. This is what we put in place, and this is how it's made a difference. Again, with that internal communications, it's quite difficult for us to be able to have a view on, because obviously that's not published externally.
I love the "you said we did" idea. I mean, that's we've seen that done to really great effect in other sectors. It's such a great way of utilizing the information that you've got and turning it from a negative into a positive. Another kind of issue that we've had, particularly with, that we've heard about, particularly from smaller housing associations, is when you're made aware of an issue, for example, with a process, which is likely to be impacting lots of residents, but you feel like a lot of the residents who this is impacting just don't seem to be providing feedback. How can you go about like demonstrating and quantifying the impact of smaller volumes in kind of key complaint areas? How do you go about taking those complaints that you do have and making decisions based on them when you know that there's probably more people suffering from this issue than there are complaints to show it?
So residents not providing feedback can be difficult because most residents simply just want to be left alone to live their lives and often only contact landlords when a repair is needed or something's gone wrong. So we use the term find your silence. It's been used a lot recently in this regard. And I think that this means using other forms of intelligence and information that might be available to you. So talking to your staff, what are they seeing as problems or hindrances to providing service that they would wish to provide? Are there any particular neighbourhoods or areas where there are more complaints received in comparison to another, and why might that be? And having that record of not just issues relating to a person logging it, but have it, so thinking about noise, for example, having several noise reports from a particular building or a particular resident and having it linked to both of them so you can monitor. They're not all separate cases. You can see that actually this particular building, there's an issue within this building. So digging down into the data and doing some more analysis around sort of the types of complaints and where they're coming from.
That's really interesting. So sorry, just so I've got that. You recommend or you've seen some organizations kind of almost surveying their staff and understanding from them what the kind of key issues are, because there might be kind of nuance that you don't see in individual complaints that a staff member having been to the same building a few times might have spotted, for example.
So it's just basically good communication within the organisation and talking to staff to find out what are those underlying issues. And I talk about the Delilah technique, which is the why, Delilah. And that allows you to dig down into root causes that are perhaps occurring across certain particular buildings, certain particular areas, and to get into those, that dig down into those and do a bit of root cause analysis and use the Delilah technique. So yeah, I think good communication can be used so well within organisations, but also with residents, and getting out into the neighbourhoods, talking with your residents, finding out from them what the issues are, and then trying new things, linking in with other similar organisations, seeing what they've done, what's worked well, and then trying it out. And that communication again with the residents, say, we're trying to do something about this and we want to work with you to improve this for you. So just the importance of communication, I think, is what I'm trying to get across, really.
I love it. You've left me with the picture of Tom Jones in my head now. Which is...
Who could ask for anything more?
I'm interested in your thoughts on data standardization. One of the issues that we come up against is, all housing associations have relatively similar issues. The question is, are they more or less prevalent in their data set compared to everybody else's data sets? Because, similar things are going to happen to different housing associations. We've been speaking to HAC quite a lot about their data standardization models, which we think is quite interesting. Where are you guys on this? What advice do you have for us at the start of our journey looking at data standardization?
Yeah, there's quite a few organisations that sort of have those benchmarking groups like Housemark and CIH, and there's many others. So yeah, get engaged with others in the sector and find out, what they're doing, what they've tried, and what worked and what didn't, and what are the issues that they're experiencing.
So again, we're coming back to that communication idea, but this time, let's get housing associations communicating with each other and communicating with these other bodies to help build up a kind of a common sense of what's possible there.
I think we're seeing that at the minute, aren't we, with some smaller housing associations? Often we're getting approached by smaller housing associations who are saying, we want to do all of this stuff, but we're not necessarily resourced in the same way that some of our, larger counterparts are. Any advice for them or ideas of best practice for smaller housing associations?
So it might be that a smaller housing association only gets a handful of complaints a month, in comparison to a large one, but focus should still be on handling those complaints well and in line with the complaint handling code.
Perfect.
Oh, and also use your subscription to the Housing Ombudsman service. So we've got loads of training, guidance notes. You can call us for advice if you want to discuss a complaint. You don't need to wait for your residents to contact us before engaging with us. As we mentioned about the Housing Ombudsman Centre for Learning, so we'll be sharing lots of examples in there of good practice. And although smaller housing associations are still bound by the same requirements in the complaint handling code, we do adopt more of a hand-holding approach where we can see additional guidance and support is needed to help those smaller landlords achieve compliance. So we would advise reach out to us and seek help if you need it.
She's a one-woman plug machine. It's unbelievable.
That was my favourite so far. That's been fascinating. Thank you so much. And you've been particularly Polly's been braving coughing while she's been talking to us. I wondered whether you had any final or any specific message for housing associations. If there's one sort of takeaway that you would have for them to consider, what would it be?
Good communication, good records, contemporaneous records, engaging with others in the sector, always having a plan. If you're not doing something, we're interested in, what is the plan to get you to the point you should be.
Don't be afraid of complaints, I'd say, is one of our key messages. Don't be afraid. I don't like the phrase golden nuggets, but they're golden nuggets. And take that and use that to improve your services. Don't be afraid to contact us for support if you need that support. That's partly why we're here. And also, when you do get things right, tell your residents about it, because so many landlords, their residents' opinion is that they're not doing anything, but actual fact, they've got some really good things going on, but they don't tell them. I guess the other thing is find your silence. Find out who's not contacting you. Why aren't they contacting you? What's going on? If you don't know what's happening, then you can't make sure that the services that you provide are the services that your residents need.
Wow, what an interview, Steve. Talk us through it. What did you think?
Well, it's such a fascinating job that they have, and I think I learned so much about the role that they're trying to play, and I think it's a really interesting thing how the Housing Ombudsman is dealing with a lot of the same things that the housing associations are dealing with, particularly around like the amount of new traffic of complaints that they're now dealing with, but also how they're really keen to get out there and educate and be thought leaders in this challenging new time that we're all finding ourselves in. So I thought it was really fascinating to hear from them and to get a sense of what they're trying to achieve.
I completely agree. I can't imagine how challenging it is to do their job.
Our jobs are so easy. We're just trying to teach computers how to read. I mean, compared to what they're having to deal with, we're living the high life.
There's a certain simplicity in what we do, isn't there? It's kind of like, you got to enjoy it. Sarcasm, but otherwise there's not very much kind of political stuff. But also I think it'd be really easy to be cynical about that line about if you get a complaint, it's not a failure, it's a success, because that's giving you the ammunition to do stuff about it, and that's it just feels like it's insincere and all that kind of thing. But actually it's not, and I think I really like all of the stuff that they're doing, wrapping with the knowledge information stuff. I really like the way that they are taking this as an educational opportunity to actually lead some of the change in the industry and help other people kind of do the same. And I think that's kind of hard and interesting. And I think it's definitely an approach that I sort of think is smart.
I absolutely, and I thought the knowledge information management stuff was so interesting because they were pointing to it as one of the key things that can go wrong. And if you think about that in housing, like the number of things that can and do go wrong in housing, so much more can go wrong with a house than can go wrong with most products that people have. But still, one of the biggest challenges, one of the things that was really pushing issues over into, wow, this could be a real problem, was around data handling. It was around reporting. It was around those kind of things that all companies now have to deal with data and have to understand how are we ensuring that data is turning into action. And I thought that was really fascinating in terms of the way in which they've highlighted the way in which you manage your data as being one of the things that you really need to get a handle on.
Yeah. And they're seeing clearly across the board that that's a challenge, and it's not a sexy challenge, right? The stuff we do is really sexy. You can pull in the load of customer information, and we go, hey, this is what your customers are talking about. We can always find something that they've suspected but haven't known, or you look hard enough, you'll find something that's just intrinsically and inherently interesting. And everybody's a word nerd. Everybody loves words, and they're kind of into that stuff. Data management is not sexy. It's really hard. It requires technical people to do difficult things. It's not always the most kind of, effervescent of subjects to be thinking about. But I guarantee, 9 of the 10 problems that we have are in getting data into the platform. Once data's in our platform, the rest is pretty straightforward. So I think it's such an important thing. And for me, another thing that I like that they sort of spoke about was just recognizing the fact that everybody's on a data journey and different people are at different stages as well.
Absolutely.
And I think that's vital and fascinating.
100%. And we find that because we work with organizations of all different sizes, including some of the biggest global brands. And even they are, they're taking their time. They're using a phased approach to digitizing, getting everything in the same place. Even they're not trying to do everything at once. And I think that was really interesting that the ombudsman were really were open to understanding that everybody's trying and to get better, and it doesn't have to be perfect right away. It's about showing that you're improving and showing that you're trying. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and also the different expectations for different people at different sizes, right?
Yeah,
which I think is entirely justified and appropriate.
Absolutely. And then when we got into the how to get the most out of your data stuff, I thought they had some really brilliant advice. And I don't know if you want to sing along with me for the best bit of advice that I took from that. I'm not even sure if we're allowed, to be honest, whether that would get us a copyright strike, because we'll sound just exactly like Tom Jones. I think the Delilah principle was something that I thought was really a great way of describing that stuff that we're often talking about in our work around getting to the root cause, going from the big numbers to the thing that you can act upon. And that process is all about asking why multiple times and regressing back to the initial cause that started this all off. And I thought the Delilah principle was a beautiful way of articulating that.
So, as you know, I'm a sucker for good branding, right?
Sure you are.
And the 5 Whys principle I first came across it as something that came out of Toyota as part of the thing that they did in sort of lean manufacturing. It was nicked and repackaged by Eric Ries, who wrote The Lean Startup, which, one of the greatest business books in the history of the world, led to was related to a lot of the kind of the Scrum innovation stuff, which as software people, we know only too well. But what the Ombudsman guys have done really brilliantly is brand it. Like, the 5 Whys has been around for ages, but the Delilah principle, they smashed that.
Whole new thing. I love that as well. That journey that methodology's taken. I think it's a wonderful way of thinking about where you might be able to get useful, actionable knowledge. I don't think startup books are just for startups. And I've learned loads about what we do every day in startups. Reading books meant for big organizations, reading books meant for completely different ends. And I think it's really interesting to see how these kind of these methodologies take their journey to find kind of useful places and like you say, also reinventing themselves and rebranding themselves.
be honest, was it Scottish mythology that you've been reading instead of business books?
Yes, absolutely. It was The Five Whys of Finn McCool is a wonderful read.
Yeah, no, I like loads of stuff there to go after, and I think these are subjects that we're going to be returning to in one guise or another in forthcoming pods, and also the Nerdcast live series. I know that one of the things that we're keen to do is get some examples of some of the great innovations in sort of customer feedback analysis that smaller housing associations, insights teams are bringing to the table. We work with some amazing people who are doing some really incredible things, but the resourcing challenges for some people at the smaller end of the scale are real, and I think it's really interesting to look at how you make these steps along what is this data journey. So that's a really good one. I think data standardization is something that I know you feel passionately about as well. I think we're in a really, there's obviously these people out there, Housemark and other people that have been benchmarking for a long time. Yeah. But I think we've got a really brilliant opportunity to benchmark people's data against other data sets to show whether an issue is more or less of an issue for them than other housing associations, which I think really starts to contextualize these things and allow you to work out, what are the things that you should be putting most effort into fixing, because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, right? It's not
doesn't matter without action.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter without action. And I thought we made fun of them a little bit for the number of plugs that they managed to sneak into the thing, but that was entirely born of the fact that they really want housing associations to reach out to them. And I think if you are a housing association listening to this, thinking about what you should be sharing with the Ombudsman, thinking about challenges that you're facing, but also thinking about best practice that you're developing, thinking about how your data journey is developing. They want to know, they want to understand that, and they want to help provide you with that best practice as well.
But yeah, look, Polly, Victoria, thank you guys so much for your time if you're listening to this. Thank you too to all of you out there who've joined us. It's been, I hope, as fascinating for you as it has been for us. I think this is a topic that's not going to go away, and it's only going to become more and more relevant as the weeks roll on. So thank you so much for joining us today on episode 1 of the Nerdcast. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a lovely conversation.
Pretty good, hasn't it?
Thank you, Steve, for A, showing up, B, holding it together by saying actually interesting things, and C, lasting 0.7 seconds before your first bald gag. I think
it is a personal best of hanging out with you and bald gags. So
yeah, no, well done on that. If you're joining us for the first time, which is everybody here, then look out for future episodes. We'll do likey, subscribey things in due course, but we will be putting out more content around some of these issues. So keep an eye on our website and all of the usual channels, and we will see you next time on the Nerdcast. Hang on, I can't get to this thing. Bloody Max. Look at this. How do I get rid of that?
Get rid of what?
That
thing.
thing.
I don't know. It's an absolute diabolical.